Now we're into part 2 of chapter 13. The next thing we need to talk about is party unity. Party voting and cohesion was much more evident in the 90s than from the 60s through the 80s. Today, the splits often reflect deep ideological differences between parties or party leaders. In the past, splits were a product of party discipline. The focus was then on winning elections, dispensing patronage, and keeping power. If voters are usually in the center on political issues, why is there a deep division between the two parties? A. Congressional districts are drawn to give an advantage to one party or another. General elections are no longer competitive. The favored party usually wins. Primary elections to pick candidates is the only election that really counts. The people who vote in primaries are usually more ideologically motivated. Since voters follow positions of congressional leaders, voters may also now be more partisan. The old seniority rule whereby committee chairs went to senior committee members has been altered. Since the 107th Congress, chair selection reflects members' support of key party positions on issues. Cues given by and taken from fellow party members are interesting. It is important to note that in the 110th Congress, 07-08, the chair of every committee with one exception went to a senior committee member. Caucuses are another issue. Caucuses are associations of members of Congress created to advocate a political ideology or a regional or economic interest. They gained leadership roles in the 1970s when congressional power became more decentralized. Although Republicans were reportedly going to abolish caucuses when they assumed control of the House in 1995, there were 290 caucuses in 2006. The influence of caucuses is really debatable. The committee system is really interesting, or the organization of Congress into committees. There are legislative committees are the most important organizational feature of Congress. They consider bills or legislative proposals. They maintain oversight of executive agencies, and they conduct investigations. The types of committees are standing committee, select committee, joint committees, and conference committees. As far as committee practices are concerned, the majority party has majority of seats on the committees and names the chair. Assignments: the House members usually serve on 2 standing committees or 1 exclusive committee. Senators serve on 2 major committees and 1 minor committee. Chairs are elected. Usually the most senior member of the committee is elected by the majority party. Seniority has definitely been under attack in recent decades in both parties. The preference is to give someone the chair who is the most qualified, but that doesn't always happen. There is a subcommittee Bill of Rights of 1970s that changed several traditions. The House committee chairs are elected by secret ballot in party caucuses. No House member or senator may chair more than 1 committee. All House committees with more than 20 members are to have at least 4 subcommittees. Committees in both houses gained larger staffs. Also, House members gained more personal staffers. House and Senate committee meetings were to be open to the public unless members voted to close them. Decentralizing reforms made the House more inefficient, and committee chairs consequently utilized controversial practices to gain controls, for example, proxy votes. In 1995, House Republicans implemented changes, such as giving chairmen the ability to select staff members, banning proxy voting, and imposing term limits on leadership positions. In 1995, Senate Republicans also imposed term limits on all committee chairmen and required committee members to select chairmen by secret ballot. Certain committees tend to attract particular types of legislators. Policy-oriented members are attracted to finance or foreign policy committees, and constituency-oriented members are attracted to small business or veterans affairs committees. The organization of Congress: staff and specialized offices. Tasks of staff members: Constituency service is a major task of member staff. Approximately one-third of the members' staff work is in the district, and almost all members have at least one full-time district office. Legislative functions of staff include devising proposals, negotiating agreements, organizing hearings, meeting with lobbyists and administrators. A member's staff consider themselves advocates of their employers. They have an entrepreneurial function, and sometimes they're very independent. Members of Congress can no longer keep up with increased legislative work, and so must rely on a large staff. The results of a larger staff member: more legislative work in the chamber, more individualistic Congress. Staff agencies. Staff agencies work for Congress as a whole, providing specialized knowledge equivalent to the president's. The major staff agencies are listed on this slide. The next section deals with how a bill becomes law. Bills travel through Congress at different speeds. Bills to spend money or to tax or to regulate business move slowly. Bills with a clear, appealing idea move fast, especially if they do not require large expenditures. The complexity of legislative process helps a bill's opponents. Introducing a bill. Bills must be introduced by a member of Congress. A public bill pertains to public affairs, generally. A private bill pertains to a particular individual, now rare and usually delegated to administrative agencies or courts. Pending legislation does not carry over from one Congress to another. It must be reintroduced. Congress does initiate most legislation. There are certain things called resolutions. A simple resolution is passed by one house and affects that house, not signed by the president, and does not have the force of law. A concurrent resolution is passed by both houses and affects both, not signed by the president, does not have the force of law. A joint resolution is essentially a law. It's passed by both houses. It's signed by the president. If used to propose a constitutional amendment, two-thirds vote required in both houses, but the president's signature is unnecessary. There is such a thing called legislative productivity. Recent studies of congressional productivity followed 9/11 have yielded some interesting results. First, Congress's legislative output over the past 2 decades has declined. How do you measure legislative productivity? Well, comparisons were made to legislative output in the 1930s, when Congress funded many programs to combat the Great Depression. A similar period of heightened legislative productivity occurred during the 1960s, when Congress attempted to address the problems of low incomes with the war on poverty. How do you evaluate legislation output or a decline in overall legislative activity? Scholars debate the meaning of this reduced activity, with some taking the position that Congress is in decline. Others argue that Congress is a broken branch of government. Does reduced legislative activity reflect the fact that during much of the 1980s and 1990s, America had a divided government? Most scholars tend to believe that divided government only reduces the passage of far-reaching and costly legislation. A fourth area of concern involves earmarks. Earmarks, which are expenditures for specific projects or tax exemptions to specific groups. Earmarks have tripled since 1994. In 2006, 13,000 earmarks cost $64 billion. This form of congressional activity has come under broad attack following the scandals involving the lobbyist Jack Abramoff and Congressman Randy Duke Cunningham. Earmarks persist because constituents demand such support from each member of Congress. The fifth area of concern reflects a post-9/11 report that expressed concern over the potential impact of a terrorist attack on Congress. Such an attack would cause chaos in the legislature because it would take months to hold special elections to replace members of the House. Senate members could be rapidly replaced by temporary appointments by governments. Study by committees. A bill is referred to a committee for consideration by either the Speaker or the presiding officer of the Senate. The chamber rules define each committee's jurisdiction, but sometimes the Speaker has to make a choice. The Speaker's decision can be appealed to the full House. All revenue bills must originate in the House. Most bills die in committee. Multiple referrals are permitted until 1995, and the new rule allows only sequential referrals. After hearings and markup sessions, the committee reports a bill out to the full House or Senate. If the bill is not reported out, the House can use the discharge petition. If the bill is not reported out, the Senate can pass a discharge motion, rarely used. These are routinely unsuccessful. A bill must be placed on a calendar to come for a vote before either House. House Rules Committee sets the rules for consideration. A closed rule sets time limit on debate and restricts amendment. An open rule permits amendments from the floor. A restrictive rule permits only some amendments. The use of closed and restrictive rules increased from the 70s to the 90s. Rules can be bypassed in the House, moved to suspend rules, discharge petition, and calendar Wednesdays. Those are all rarely done. In the Senate, the majority leader must negotiate the interests of individual senators. Floor debate in the House. The Committee of the Whole is the procedural device for expediting House consideration of bills. It cannot pass bills. Committee sponsor of a bill organizes the discussion. No riders, which are non-germane amendments, are allowed. The House usually passes the sponsoring committee's version of the bill. Floor debate in the Senate. Occurs no rule limiting germaneness of amendments, so riders are very common. Committee hearing process can be bypassed by a senator with a rider, or if the bill already has passed in the House. Debate can be limited only by a cloture vote. 3/5 of the Senate must vote in favor of ending a filibuster. Both filibusters and successful cloture votes becoming more common. It's easier now to stage a filibuster, so roll calls are replacing long speeches. A filibuster can be curtailed by double tracking, which is a disputed bill is shelved temporarily so the Senate can continue other business. Effectively, neither party controls the Senate unless it has at least 75 votes. Otherwise, the Senate must act as a bipartisan majority. Methods of voting. To investigate voting behavior, one must know how a legislator voted on key amendments as well as on the bill itself. Procedures for voting in the House are voice vote, standing vote, teller vote, roll call vote, which is now electronic. Senate voting is the same except no teller vote and no electronic counters. Differences in the Senate and House versions of a bill. If they're minor, the last House to act merely sends the bill to the other House, which accepts the changes. If it's major, a conference committee is appointed. Decisions are approved by a majority of each delegation. The conference report often slightly favors the Senate version of the bill. Conference reports go back to each House. The report can only be accepted or rejected, not amended. If the report is accepted, usually since the alternative is often to have no bill at all, so the report is generally accepted. Bill in final form goes to the President. The President may sign it. If the President vetoes it, it returns to the House of Origin. Both Houses must support the bill with a 2/3 vote in order to override the President's veto. The last thing is the issue on ethics, reducing power and perks. Some suggestions: regulate franking, pass Congress under the law, place Congress under the law. The Congressional Accountability Act of 1995 was passed, where Congress obliged itself to obey 11 major employment laws. They also created the Independent Office of Compliance to deal with implementation, avoiding excessive executive power over Congress. Also, trim the pork. Bills containing money to provide for local projects such as bridges, dams, and so on. Misallocation of tax dollars for trivial benefits. The main cause of the deficit is entitlement programs, not pork. Most categories of pork have had decreased funding in the past 10 to 15 years. Identifying pork is a judgment call since most district funding is necessary, and pork facilitates compromise among members who are also supposed to be district advocates. So trimming the pork is just not that easy. That's the end of Chapter 13. Please refer to How a Bill Becomes Law in 11 not-so-easy steps on the PowerPoint that is online.